Toto, welcome again to Hard Copy.
Thanks for having me. Always a delight.
All right, let's start off with the bigger story, which has to do with our INEC chairman. And you know why this is a very important conversation? Because it's a conversation we've had before.
Yeah.
We've talked about the fact that the INEC chairman is an appointee of the president.
Yeah.
But your voice was loudest when it was Rex. You remember when it was the resident electoral commissioners who were card-carrying members of political parties, and you made quite a ruckus then. How did that end?
Well, it ended the way it ended. And that's, yes, some of them got appointed, and to a large extent, they served their term. But one thing is very sure, and that is that at a time when it was necessary for citizens to speak, to reject every attempt by the political class to capture the election management body, it was resisted by citizens. And I think that's what democracy is about. It's about how citizens are able to push back on authoritarian tendencies, especially when people who are custodians of democratic or political power, public trust, fail to play the game by its rules.
At the time, I think the bone of contention was Loretta Onoche.
Yeah, it was Loretta Onoche. Yes, the National Assembly rejected Loretta Onoche, although they gave reasons related to federal character. But at least Nigerians spoke and they rejected Loretta Onoche. There were also other nominations that were made, and in the book that we talk about, I talk about some of the retrogressive legacies of the late President Buhari, aside late appointments into INEC, but they were very partisan appointments, that were made. And this brings us back to how do you protect the independence of INEC?
One of the things you wrote, just so we don't miss that point, in that part in your book, I think it's in, not in that moment,
yes, Eyes on the Ballot.
Eyes on the Ballot. So one of the things you talked about in Eyes on the Ballot, where you mentioned this legacy, not so good legacy, when it comes to election matters of the late President Muhammadu Buhari, you talked about the fact that there were lessons that President Bola Ahmed Tinubu should learn.
Absolutely.
So that his name doesn't go down the annals of history in that same...
And I highlighted those reasons. The first one is non-interference with the Electoral Commission. There's one lesson to learn there. The other one is all these late appointments. Later this year, close to just 4 or 5 months to the elections, there are about 4 or 5 national commissioners that would leave. It's just the fact that the late President Buhari delayed his appointment into INEC, and that sort of altered the calendar. If the timetable for the 2027 elections were not amended and elections brought back to January 16th, on the eve of the 2027 elections under the previous calendar, you would have about 4 or 5 national commissioners leaving just before the results of the presidential elections were declared. And these were the things that we're always advocating, and drawing the attention of politicians and political leaders to what the provisions of the law say and the political consequences of some of the actions that they take. Because often they are guided by very primordial partisan political interests, and they forget the overall interest, of the public and also our democracy.
So let's fast forward to 2026. We're now looking at an INEC chairman who's been accused of being partisan.
The mere fact that Nigerians don't trust the electoral process, don't trust INEC, is a fundamental problem, because how then do you expect them to believe that results that come out of elections is indeed a reflection of their will and aspiration? A non-partisan and an independent INEC is critical and central to any successful elections. Therefore, INEC and other institutions need to engage in actions that do not put their neutrality, their objectivity, and their independence to question. The last few days have raised a lot of questions, and that's why citizens are asking. And our position is that there is need for greater explanation. Nigerians still need a full, transparent explanation as to what happened. Good a thing, there will be investigation, no doubt. So we'll wait to see what's the outcome of the investigation. There are also other independent investigation that is being conducted to particularly unravel, what has really transpired. But I don't think that any political leader should make sweeping statements and trivialize, this issue, because it is central, to the integrity and the non-partisanship of the process.
INEC investigating INEC?
Well, INEC said they've, they contacted a state agency, to investigate this particular issue.
Should Professor Amupitan step aside while an investigation is ongoing? Or is it too close to the election for him to do that? Well,
I've seen a lot of calls, for his resignation and for him to step aside. And I say two things. The first one is that when you think about, first, those who make those calls out of a legitimate reason. They have a right, to make the calls. But there are also, provisions within our laws, and that needs to be followed. But we need to unravel this particular case, and I think an investigation will do that. And I'm confident that some of the independent investigation that will be conducted on this will unravel some of the facts. But also forget that a lot of this mistrust is also driven by some of the actions, that INEC has taken in the recent past. And so there's a constellation of this. And I don't think that, one statement is enough to address the concerns that citizens have about this. They are legitimate questions, and those questions need to be answered. But whilst also not ignoring that there are lots of fabrication, out there. There's a lot of disinformation out there. And I think an investigation should also unravel where is fact and where is fiction.
It turns out after the investigations, it turns out that this was him. This was him who posted those things.
Yeah.
And I'm going to get into the fact that, what if I don't know if I'm going to be INEC chairman personally? I'm a Nigerian. I'm allowed to have political affiliations.
Yeah, you're allowed to have political. And then I happen to
now become INEC chairman some years. Let's say me now. I'm a fan of yours. And then I start to hate
my respectful view for considering our politics, considering the nature of our electoral process. I don't think that anyone who has had, political affiliation, to the extent that you are either a member of a political party or you have vigorously and publicly campaigned for a political party, should, go into INEC. It was on that basis that we rejected Loretta Onoche's appointment. It was on that basis that subsequent commissioners that we know had partisan leanings, we strongly opposed that. So if it is established that an individual has had either political, affiliation, or has been a member of a political party, or has campaigned for a political party, in the interest of the trust of our electoral process, those individuals should not be appointed into INEC, because it becomes a burden, for the Electoral Commission, because public trust is really critical, for the electoral process. And in this instant case, it has not been established that the current INEC chairman either is a member of a political party or has campaigned. Again, we'll just have to wait, to see what's the outcome of this investigation.
If the investigation turns out that this was him, what would you suggest that he does in that situation?
Now, again, if the investigation, it depends on what the investigation unravels.
If it unravels that this was his account, and he's a Tinubu sympathizer, and actually, because not just one post, there are about 3 that I can remember, and they weren't all done at once. So this is someone's post over time.
Yeah.
If it does come out that yes, this was him, Grok wasn't hallucinating, and this was him that posted these things, then what?
I think that there are 2 things. The first one is he has to make that judgment call. The second is the law would also need to have its full course, and there are two basic options that are really available. But until then, we just really have to wait to see what this investigation unravels. But my principled position is that if you have any individual who has been partisan, I don't think they should go anywhere near INEC.
So let's go all the way back to the very first domino that was toppled in our electoral process, that actually put INEC in a position where we don't trust you. Is that the INEC chairman is an appointee of the president. I don't know how any other person's mind works, but if I appointed you, you work for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is it so important for the president to be the one to appoint the INEC chairman? And why hasn't that part of our electoral process been brought up and changed the way you all brought the other parts and said, let's change this in the interest of Nigerians?
So, for the benefit of all those watching us across the world, there's nothing, wrong with a president, especially in a presidential system of government, for the president, to appoint people into, whether you call them federal executive bodies. In other parts of the world, the president appoints, officials into electoral commissions. But in those contexts, they do not have the kinds of politicians that we have in Nigeria. Politicians that we have in Nigeria, for the most part, do not have regards for the rule of law. They have a do or die, attitude towards politics. And our institutions of accountability are weak. In other climes, you still see appointees of the president still go against, and they can challenge.
Oh, challenging the president.
In this particular climate, you don't dare do that. Even if you express dissent, you are tagged as an opposition. In fact, you are even asked to resign. This is why Justice Uwais Committee, 18 years ago, recommended that the power to appoint the INEC chairman and resident electoral commissioners should be removed from the president, because it is the same president that is considered the leader of a political party, the same president that is on the ballot. So the operational independence of the Electoral Commission is not constitutionally guaranteed as long as the president is the one who appoints. But you ask yourself, you have a National Assembly that should perform due diligence, on what? On the appointments, nominations by the president. Do they perform and scrutinize those appointments? Even when petitions are written, they are not considered on their merit. They are instead abandoned and rejected because of partisan political considerations. And so the bigger question for us is, within our context, this practice where the president appoints, it's no longer tenable.
All right, so let's go back to election reforms. I know we have to focus on the elections, but like I asked before we went on that break, when we were talking about reforms in the election, is this president's part where he's the one that nominates the INEC chairman, it's not a part of the reforms?
No, it is a part of the reforms, but Kayla, we're less than 9 months to the 2027 election.
It's too soon.
I think that the reform that we need is the reform of the mindset of the political class. First, beginning with those who are pushing for this one-party dominant state. Democracy is about competition. The moment you eliminate competition, it doesn't serve the interests of the people.
But it's a competition.
It's a competition.
And I beat you.
But there is an onslaught, on the opposition. For instance.
But you entered a ring. Don't bring a knife to a gunfight.
But the level playing, there's a reason why the elections are guided by the principles of fairness and freeness and credibility and inclusiveness. You cannot say that the process is fair when you make laws that disproportionately impacts on opposition parties. You cannot say there is fairness when opposition parties cannot have access to public facilities to conduct their political affairs. When state governments introduce high fees, exorbitant and exploitative fees, restricting advertisements in the state.
The Anambra state government said they didn't do that either.
It's not just Anambra. There are several states who have done this. Edo State, there are a couple of states who actually did this. So you can't say it is fair, right? It's the same way you can't just say that there is fairness when there are conflicting and disturbing judgments that come from our courts. So just look at it, the insidious way and manner at which we are decimating the opposition does not bode well for political legitimacy. You can make every argument you want, you can make any excuses you want. In fact, you can shift blame as much as you want. But in the minds and in the hearts of people, what Nigerians see is that there is an attempt to shrink the space for the emergence of opposition actors, because democracy and elections are a festival. Those who have superior arguments, who have performed, should come to the table and debate. That way, you give we, the citizens, the opportunity of choice, because that autonomy that we have to make choice, it has to be based on a presentation by different actors. Then we can now decide. But if your political strategy is to eliminate every opponent and just ensure that you're the only one on the ballot, it's no longer democracy. It doesn't absorb the opposition parties from their own mismanagement and their poor leadership. That's not what we are saying. I am making a principle and a value-based argument here and judgment here. It doesn't mean that the parties, opposition parties, need to be protected and shielded from their mistakes. They also have a role to play. And the question is this, a problem of the political class where they don't also play by the rules? Because even in the opposition parties, they don't also play by the rules. So when you think about the disease, it's a disease that affects both the ruling party and the opposition parties. You talk about internal democracy in the parties. As you look at the ruling party, you ask yourself, look at the opposition parties as well. Do they also have internal democracy within their parties? How come they're having all sorts of leadership challenges? But those are internal affairs of the political parties. But it affects us because they are the ones who come canvassing for our votes. Therefore, the same standards that we use to measure the ruling party, we must also use the same standards to measure opposition parties.
Has the FC Minister apologized?
Apologize for what?
Well, at the time, you and other civil society organizations, at the time when he said he was going to shoot our brother, Sean Kimbaloye, from the TV, even though he said it was in jest, what civil society asked for was an apology.
Yeah.
Did you get the apology?
Well, the apology is not to us. The apology is to the entire country.
Did he give that?
He is trying to explain the rationale behind his statement. But you see, that act is a manifestation of a bigger problem. And that bigger problem is that we are now a society without red lines. Those red lines have been so erased by the conduct of our ruling political class. And it's just this institutionalization of impunity that has brought us to a point where people in power think that they can do anything and say anything and get away with it. But if an ordinary citizen asks an accountability question, they are not just considered an opposition, but the state deploys its machinery to go after that individual. It's a function of what? The absence and the erasure of red lines. In advanced and developed societies, there are red lines that nobody, regardless of your political status, should cross. And I think that making a statement, I don't care whether it was a joke, but within the Nigerian context, for someone as highly reputed to come on air and make those kinds of statements, I think that it was an overreach and still deserving of an apology. I don't care what's the relationship that predated that statement, but for the interest of our safety and our security, but that there are red lines that we should not cross as a people. That if you sell your vote at elections, you've also crossed the red line as a citizen. And that's why you cannot sell your vote regardless of your economic status, because when you do that, you bastardize the whole notion of democracy. The reason why these leaders are not listening to you is because you sold your votes to them. When you stay away from voting at elections, you're also doing what? Erasing the red line, because elections are a tool, a political accountability tool. This is why people need to show up at the next elections and not just show up and vote and go and sleep. Because what these folks want you to do is to say your vote will not count, so that you stay away. And the more citizens stay away from the polling units, we allow bad rule and bad leadership emerge. We make it easier for people to rig elections when citizens don't show up. Show up in your large numbers in the next elections and insist that those results must be counted at the polling units, the results are recorded, and they are transmitted electronically as clearly stated in the Electoral Act.